Hello and welcome to IG's Trading the Markets podcast. Brexit talks continue and the clock is ticking. Both sides have said a deal needs to be reached in October to give enough time for ratification before the transition period comes to an end in December. So can the two sides resolve their differences before the end of the month? And what could the different outcomes mean for markets? With me to discuss is Martin Essex from Daily FX. Martin, great to have you on the podcast.
Good to be here, Victoria.
So let's start with Boris Johnson. He's expected to speak with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen today. How might that conversation tonight go, do you think?
The European Council meeting that starts tomorrow was always meant to be the crucial date, a two-day meeting of EU leaders to discuss the state of negotiations. And indeed, Boris Johnson said that October the 15th was his deadline. However, I think neither of those things are actually true anymore. It seems to me that there won't be a deal at the European Council meeting, and Johnson will simply let his deadline go by. That said, I do think eventually there will be a bare bones deal. It's just that soft deadlines essentially don't matter to politicians. They come and they go. What really matters is December the 31st, which, as you said, is when the transition period ends. I think there will be a bare bones deal by then. I don't think there will be much of a deal before then.
Okay, so as you mentioned, we've got this EU summit leaders meeting that's tomorrow and Friday. I mean, what developments, if any, are we expecting this week?
I really don't think there will be anything very serious agreed. There are still many outstanding issues. Fisheries is one that comes to mind, and the two sides still seem to be as far apart as they ever have been. Fishing has just become an issue that both sides have dug in on, and if either side were to give way, it would be seen that they'd somehow failed, that they'd lost the negotiations. It's not so much an economic issue, it's become a real political issue. It's become something that both sides can say, this is the issue that we've really stood up to the other side on, and, we've got our way. And it's not a matter of economics, it's a matter of politics. There's so many more important things to think about. State aid, for example. And the whole issue of state aid is also wide open. And yet, they're talking about fishing, and I've got nothing against fishing. I mean, it, of course, is an important industry, but it's a small one. So I'm not entirely sure why there is so much focus on it. So, as I said, I think there will be a deal, but the two sides are still way, way apart, and it's hard to see anything serious coming out of this. Johnson will simply say, oh, well, I did set that deadline, but it's only a soft deadline, and we'll continue talking. Everybody will continue pushing and shoving and saying, well, they've got to give ground and we've given ground already. But it's all really just posturing. The key fact is that a deal is in the interests of both sides, and therefore it's almost certain to me that there will be a deal, just not yet.
Now, you mentioned fishing. What are some of the other key issues that are preventing the two sides from seeing eye to eye? I mean, I know that fair economic competition is one that's been raised quite a bit. Talk to us a bit about that and any other important ones we should know about.
Yes, this is the issue I mentioned about state aid. The whole point is that governments are not meant to give aid to failing industries to enable them to compete with other industries that are more efficient elsewhere and don't have state aid. And this is serious for all sides in this discussion. Some countries have perhaps bent the rules a little bit in the past. They've sort of found ways to give aid to some industries that they regard as important. Others have really stuck by the rules and said no state aid at all. It's an important issue because what you don't want is, or at least what the other side doesn't want, is a government supporting an industry that's really inefficient and thereby, distorting competition, giving their own side an unfair advantage. And it's fair enough. Everybody says, well, we don't really want that to happen. We want the rules. We want the even playing field. We want everybody to be equal. And it seems fair enough. But again, it's hard to reach an agreement on because governments want to be able to help industries if necessary. Like, for example, if there's competition between, let's say, Boeing in the US and Airbus in Europe, neither side wants the other to help out that company because it will harm the opposition.
Okay, let's talk about the timeline to leaving the EU now, because you alluded to the fact that politicians don't necessarily take these soft deadlines very seriously. And your expectation is that we'll get a bare bones deal by the 31st of December. But logistically, how will that work? Because at the moment, they're saying that we need to get a deal by the end of October because we need to go through this ratification process and a translation into all different languages of this deal, which should take about 2 months, making the cutoff the beginning of November. If we get a bare bones deal by December the 31st, how will that actually work?
Well, yes, I know they always say things like that, don't they? They always say things like, "Oh, well, it has to be ratified by
Mm,
Parliament," or "Yes, they need time to translate it into foreign languages." There's all these
yeah.
things that people are always talking about, and yet when it comes down to it, is that really true? I mean, can the two sides not simply sign a deal at midnight and then say, "Okay, well, tomorrow and the next few weeks, we'll do the paperwork. We'll get it through Parliament. We'll get it translated, all those other things." Um, where there's a will, there's a way. If a deal is signed at the last minute, as I said, again, I think it will be. I think that there will be plenty of time for them to say, and we will give you full details in 3 months' time. And so essentially, they'll give themselves room to make all these sort of little bureaucratic changes that they need to change. But it doesn't, I think, change the fact that the implementation period ends at the end of December the 31st. Beginning of January the 1st, the UK be entirely separate from the EU. As long as there's a skeleton deal before that deadline, there'll be plenty of time to do all these other things that they say need doing.
Okay, so the base case is for a sort of 11th hour deal. What happens if we don't get that? And what's your sort of probability of a no deal Brexit at this stage?
I think that a deal is in interests of both sides, therefore there will be one. It would be destructive of either side to say there's not going to be a deal. But on that said, both sides say they're making preparations for a no deal Brexit. And I think that probably both sides would survive that perfectly well. I know both sides would survive that. It's not in their interest to do it, but they're both sides are saying we're stepping up preparations. We're going to make sure that things are okay, and whether or not we reach a deal. Uh, and that's probably all true. I mean, they're probably, if the two sides broke up without a deal, I think that both sides would still get on fine, perhaps not as fine as they would together, but still they'd be okay because there are preparations, at least we hope there are preparations taking place in the background for no deal. You do wonder sometimes whether whether they're really doing that, but they say they are, and they're urging everybody else to do that. What are the chances of a no deal? 30%, maybe 40%. It could certainly happen, and you just wonder, though, don't you, when most of these talks are taking place relatively quietly in the background between officials. You might think that when the politicians, the prime ministers, the presidents get together, that they will bang heads together and tell their officials to do the business. So that's why I would put the chances of a deal as high as so 70%, let's say.
If you can keep your head.
When all about you are losing theirs.
What possibilities might you see?
If you can see it.
The world is yours to trade and invest. See it. IG it.
Now, aside from Brexit, of course, the key discussion point this year has been the global pandemic. Talk to us about how the coronavirus has changed the state of play when it comes to negotiations.
Well, fairly obviously, the pandemic has reduced economic growth everywhere. In fact, there's been economic contraction pretty much everywhere. There's been a lot of response to that. principally from the central banks pushing money into the global economy. Also, in some places, not in others, that there's been fiscal stimulus as well. I think what it has shown is that different countries can impose different rules, even when they are within large blocks like the European Union. If you think about it, the EU countries have all responded to the pandemic differently. There's no EU law that says somehow that everybody has to act together on this. So there are still limits to the integration that has taken place within the European Union. There are individual rules for different countries, and indeed there are restrictions on crossing between from one country to another, and that's something that certainly many politicians in France, for example, would like to stop. They'd like to be the much closer union than there is now. So what the pandemic has shown us is that countries are still able to act individually. So in that sense, it hasn't essentially changed the dynamic of Brexit. The UK is still able to impose its own rules. It would have done if it had been still a member of the EU, and it will be after it's no longer a full member of the EU. So in a sense, nothing has changed. What it has shown is that arguably the countries working together have more success than when they work separately. But I don't think it's actually changed the dynamics of the negotiations on the post-Brexit negotiations, particularly because it's simply not a matter that's part of the EU setup.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the markets now, because the pound was weakening a bit on Tuesday. This was amid concerns about a potential national UK lockdown. Do you think that the markets are more sensitive right now to COVID updates or to Brexit?
Very much to Brexit. You know, it's always been a slight surprise to me that the focus, as far as Brexit is concerned, has been on the pound specifically. I know that the pound has been falling when there's bad news and rising when there's good news as far as the negotiations are concerned. So each time a headline pops up saying that the two sides are closer together, sterling rises. When a headline pops up saying the two sides are further apart than ever, sterling moves down. I find that a little bit surprising, simply because, well, why wouldn't the euro suffer in the same way? After all, you could argue that this is not just a UK problem, it's an EU problem as well. If there's a deal, it should benefit both sides. If there's not a deal, both sides should suffer. So therefore, why does sterling move and yet not the euro? I know there are reasons for this, but it still seems a little bit odd to me. So no, sterling trading is very much focused on the state of the negotiations, and the pandemic response is very much an aside to all that. It's simply not as important as a mover. But there are things that do affect sterling as well, like well, obviously when we heard today that two American companies have paused their vaccine trials, and that is something that sends people into safe havens like the US dollar, and therefore it hits sterling. So it's not true to say that the pandemic is irrelevant for sterling traders, but very much the focus at the moment is on these negotiations.
Okay, so what's the percentage risk do you think that markets are pricing in already, and what could it mean for the pound? Because, like you say, it seems as though it's the pound that's most sensitive to developments around Brexit, rightly or wrongly.
Yes, and when you say markets, I mean, the markets respond differently, quite clearly. So you could argue that if the negotiations break up without a deal, sterling will fall really steeply, but there's an inverse relationship between sterling and London stocks. So you could argue that weakness in sterling would actually be good for the FTSE 100 index of the largest London listed stocks. You could argue that the weaker sterling gets, the higher the FTSE 100 will go, because there are so many companies in that index that are involved in banking and mining and so on, who make most of their money overseas, and that's therefore worth more when translated back into sterling. I'm not convinced that would actually happen. I think that inverse relationship could perhaps break down. So we could actually see both sterling and the FTSE 100 fall together. But I don't think the FTSE 100 would be affected that much either way, because it would benefit from the weakness of sterling, and it would, on the other hand, perhaps be depressed by smaller markets within Europe.
And very, very finally, in terms of your outlook for the pound for the rest of the year, cable at the time of recording is trading around 129.73. Where do you see us getting to in terms of the pound by the end of the year?
Well, we've been hovering somewhere around the 130 level for some time now. I think it's actually very straightforward. If we reach a deal, then sterling goes to sort of the 135, 140 level. If we don't reach a deal, it goes down to 125, 120. I think it's pretty evenly balanced, because I don't think the markets have really decided yet whether there's going to be a deal or not. I think probably the markets agree with what I just said, which is that there is likely to be some sort of deal, just not a very comprehensive one. In which case, if that is the case, if that's what's baked into prices, then you wouldn't expect sterling to move very much. But a deal brings sterling up and no deal takes sterling down. The FTSE 100 moves in the opposite direction by and large.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to my guest, Martin Essex from Daily FX. I'm Victoria Scholar, and thank you so much for listening to IG's Trading the Markets podcast. And if you enjoyed that, don't forget to subscribe.
For more videos like these, subscribe to our YouTube channel, IG UK, and make sure to follow us on Twitter. We're at IGTV.